Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Batten School. Trying to figure out where I am. The mic's here, but this screen is there. We're adjusting and adapting because today's a big day. We get to be optionally maskless or optionally masked, however you want to be. And those of you wearing masks, please continue to do so if that makes you comfortable. Let's all try to make each other comfortable. It is really my pleasure to welcome you here today to the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. We're gathered in person in a great room, and if you haven't been here, I encourage you to look around. This is the Great Hall, originally known as the Commons. It's actually built as a dining hall. But a commons is a place we can all get nourishment together for our minds, for our bodies, for our souls. I want to thank Professor Brian Williams of the Batten School and Professor Ann Coughlin of the Law School for putting this program together. I also want to thank the Batten staff team, Andrea, Henry, and Erin Torr, who do a lot of the work behind the scenes. I want to acknowledge some special guests from the University Police Department, including Chief Longo in the back, and Courtney and Danny up front, and the Charlottesville Police Department, and students in Professor Williams's Equity, Social Justice, and Social Policy undergraduate capstone course. I want to thank all of you for joining today for what I expect will be a memorable and rewarding event. Today we'll engage in conversation with Mr. Steve Schleicher, who many of you will recognize if you've watched, like I did, the trial of Derek Chauvin for the 2020 murder of George Floyd. Mr. Schleicher was the special prosecutor in the trial, and many of us watched his masterful closing argument and also his powerful cross-examination of the defense experts on use of force. We had an opportunity to see his highly effective prosecutorial style, working pro bono on behalf of the American people. So I'm looking forward to his remarks, and then a robust, we have some law students here, don't we? A robust Q&A, and Batten students. So this morning, I rewatched some of Mr. Schleicher's closing argument in the Chauvin trial. And it brought me back to May of 2020, when I assume, like many of you, I first saw that traumatizing video of the 9 minutes and 29 seconds during which George Floyd was restrained and ultimately murdered. That was an emotional moment for me, as I'm sure it was for many of you. And as dean, I normally try to hold it together, to be responsible, to be reserved, to be measured in my responses, to demonstrate hope and confidence. And you recall, we're still at the beginning of dealing with COVID, so there's enough craziness and uncertainty and fear going around. I wanted to hold things together as best I could. But when I saw that video, which was one of a series of tragic videos where mostly black and brown men and women and transgendered individuals were being killed at the hands of law enforcement not doing its job, I was literally shaking with rage and fear and sadness for this country, and I can still conjure it, that deep ache in the pit of my soul about what are we? Where is our humanity? And like many people, I was not confident that Derek Chauvin would be brought to justice. I was worried that a pattern of failure of accountability would continue. Well, thanks in part to our guest today, Mr. Steve Schleicher, the system did work to hold the officer accountable. And Mr. Schleicher humanized the victim, George P. Floyd, showing the man, the father, the son. Mr. Schleicher humanized the many witnesses who were powerless to intervene but stood by and bore witness, and they would later come testify, but actually humanized their challenge, sitting on the sidelines watching this happen. He talked about the important role of the jury and the power that only they had to convict the defendant. He's like, not me, not the judge, only you. And in so doing, declare that the use of force in that case was not reasonable. And as Mr. Schleicher eloquently said in his closing argument, it's not an anti-police prosecution, it's a pro-police prosecution. Get the police to do the right thing. And Mr. Schleicher demonstrated that Chauvin's actions were not policing, it was ego-based pride. He chose pride over policing with fatal, catastrophic consequences. And the jury had the power to condemn that. Well, there's a saying we like to use at the Batten School, that policy is everywhere, lead from anywhere. And I think the murder of George Floyd and the trial of Derek Chauvin raises many issues of policy and leadership for us to think about. Where does power reside in our democracy? What are the responsibilities of ordinary citizens? Who is accountable to whom? What are the opportunities for leadership, whether you are filming, bearing witness, or taking on the prosecution of a case? What policy changes have we seen following the conviction of Derek Chauvin? What has changed in police departments at local, state, or federal levels? What has changed in courtrooms? I think about the movement for racial equity triggered by the murder of George Floyd and what has happened since. Where has there been progress? Where has there been backlash or regress? And I think about courage and the importance of our institutions and how important it is to defend and protect them. And my own capacity for hope, seeing justice served in this case and realizing how much was achieved and how much more there is to do if we really want to see justice more broadly across our country. Well, we are so fortunate to have such an outstanding lawyer to share his perspectives on leading, following, and serving. And beyond the Chauvin case, Steve Schleicher is an experienced trial lawyer who concentrates his work on high-stakes civil litigation and products liability cases, government and internal investigations, white-collar criminal matters. A former federal prosecutor, not when he was pro bono, but when he was actually paid to be a prosecutor, working 13 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and before that in the Minnesota Attorney General's Office and Winona County Attorney's Office. Mr. Schleicher also has experience in military courts, having served as a JAG Corps officer in the United States Army Reserve. And he's prosecuted many criminal cases, including murder, like this one, other violent crime, complex narcotics conspiracies, racketeering, organized crime, fraud, and civil rights violations. Also had numerous jury trials and has conducted hundreds of investigations. Steve is often interviewed by media for his insights, and I think we're going to hear some of them today. An example, I think, of lead from anywhere. Using his immense talent and integrity for the benefit of our country, we're honored to have him today. Please join me in welcoming Attorney Steve Schleicher.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank each and, oh, great, that's right, I'm on here. I want to thank each and every one of you. It's really an honor to be here in this place, but more than that, it's an absolute honor to be here in your presence. I appreciate you coming and spending, turn this down just a little. I appreciate you coming here and spending your time with me today, because really time is the most important and precious commodity that we have to give each other. And I thank you for giving yours to me today. I'd also like to issue a bit of a warning to the dean. After hearing him speak, I think he might end up getting drafted for one of these pro bono prosecution teams at some point. So be careful, be very careful. So I wanted to talk to you today about leadership and what that means. And the title of my presentation is Courage and Compassion. Courage and compassion. On the outside of every Minneapolis Police Department squad car, written these words: to protect with courage, to serve with compassion. It's a core value of the Minneapolis Police Department. These value statements are important. They have meaning. They mean something, but only if we give life to those words. To protect with courage and to serve with compassion. And what happens when we forget our core values? When there's a breakdown in leadership? When we don't give life to those words? They become hollow and they become meaningless. On this vehicle was written those words: to protect with courage, to serve with compassion. I'll tell you a little bit about George Floyd, and I have to warn you, I am going to be showing you some images which some of you may wish to look away from. Although I'd encourage you not to. I'd encourage you not to. George Floyd had gone into this corner store, Cup Foods, at 38th and Chicago. He used what turned out to be a counterfeit $20 bill that no one ever established he knew was counterfeit to buy a pack of cigarettes and a banana. As a result of that, law enforcement officers were summoned. They ordered him to get out of his car at gunpoint relatively quickly, and he did so. They went to handcuff and restrain him, and he complied. They asked him for his name, and he identified himself. They asked him to sit down on the sidewalk, and he did that. They asked him some additional questions about what happened in the store, and he answered them. They asked him to get up. He did. He followed them. He was escorted across the street willingly, voluntarily. Keep in mind at this point, George Floyd had not raised his voice. He had not uttered a single curse word, not a threat, express or implied. Didn't try to escape, wasn't a threat to anyone, didn't threaten anyone. They escorted him across the street. He went willingly. But when he got to the car, the back of a squad car is a tiny, tiny little place. And George Floyd was a big guy. And he tried to explain to the officers that he had claustrophobia, that he just couldn't get in there. And I think if anyone watches this video and sees what happened when they were trying to put in the car, you're going to recognize, because you have common sense, that George Floyd was telling the truth. You look and see the look of sheer panic in his eyes. You look at the back of that squad car and him telling the officers, I just can't do it. I'll get in there. Let me count to three, like someone about to enter an ice-cold pool of water but just can't work up the courage. And he was starting to have a panic attack, and he was telling them. But the officers decided to force the issue, to stuff him into that car. And that's where the problem started. Right? Officers are trained and receive many hours, in the case of Minneapolis Police Department, 40 hours of scenario-based training on dealing with persons in crisis. You know who persons in crisis are? They're your friends. They're your parents. They're your relatives. Right? Those people who, for one reason or another, are not having their best day. You don't call the police on your best day. Often you're not interacting with the police on your best day. It's on your worst day. And people are complicated. They have all sorts of issues, all sorts of problems. They may find out that they're getting a divorce. They may find out that their employment of 25 years has ended. They may be struggling with drug addiction, alcohol addiction, emotional problems, all sorts of things, because people are complicated. And law enforcement deal with this every day, and they're trained to do it. But in that moment, they didn't recognize it. And they forced him into that car. And we know what happened afterwards, after he got outside. Prone, handcuffed, restrained, a knee on the neck, a knee on the back, and other officers pushing down for 9 minutes and 29 excruciating seconds. George Floyd was not a threat to anyone. Facing him that day required not 1 ounce of courage, and not 1 ounce of courage was shown to him. What was required was an ounce of compassion, and not 1 ounce was shown to him on that day. The death of George Floyd was slow, and it was painful. It's painful to watch, but it had to have been painful for George Floyd. There was a defense expert who testified in that case and was trying to define his way out of this being a use of force. If you recall his testimony, he was saying that it couldn't be an unreasonable use of force because it wasn't a use of force at all. It was an escort hold. Right? And I knew where he was going in the policy. It states that escort hold can be used. It's not technically a use of force if it's a hold that's not designed to inflict pain and is unlikely to inflict pain. That expert testified to this on the stand, and we very quickly pointed out to him the ridiculousness of his proposition. How could you deny this man's pain? This is part of the problem with forgetting your core values, forgetting your mission statement, and not being able to see someone else in that person on the ground. If you can't see yourself in George Floyd, if you can't see yourself in me, if I can't see myself in you, we've lost our humanity. And we forget our values, and we forget our mission, and we start fighting over something that's so small and so unimportant that we neglect the larger issue, the prime directive of the use of force policy, to protect the public and to preserve the sanctity of human life. Those 9 minutes and 29 seconds that George Floyd was on the ground were excruciating. He stated, "I can't breathe," 27 times. And that was denied. They didn't take him seriously. With the excuse being, well, a lot of people say that now after Gardner, right, that they can't breathe. If you can talk, you can breathe, was callously stated. You know, if you're drowning in the middle of a lake and you call out, "I'm drowning," if the answer is, well, since you're talking, you must not be drowning, right? And so I'm not going to save you. You can see that's just utter nonsense. It's utter nonsense. He struggled so hard to breathe, he was pushing himself with his shoulder, trying to make space in his lungs so that he could breathe. Unable to do that because his arms were behind his back and he was down. He actually started using his face, pushing his face against the ground to raise up so that his chest could expand, so that he could breathe. For 9 minutes and 29 seconds, they held him after he stopped moving, after he stopped talking, after he no longer had a pulse. He was not resisting the entire time. There were 4 officers on the scene, 5 if you count the park police officer. They participated. They didn't stop it. They watched, and they helped. This is a use of force. This is an abuse of power. This is a man being murdered in broad daylight in a neighborhood in front of witnesses who are shocked and horrified at what they saw. Now, the murder of George Floyd sparked worldwide outrage and anger and pain and hurt in everyone. In the city of Minneapolis in particular, but throughout the entire United States and out the entire world. This group of people, and I like to point to them, as the dean indicated, as just examples of people showing courage, but being utterly powerless to be able to act on it. Right? We have a community of people who we knew would be marginalized by the defense, who would be attacked, who would be used as an excuse, and to say the reason we had to act so aggressively and forcefully is because this angry, seething mob of people were rising up. Right? Look at them. Look at their faces. I've met them. They're good folks. These are people who were in their community, in their neighborhood. This murder happened in their backyard. Look at the look of shock and horror on their face as they see a person being executed by men in power. They're supposed to be leaders in our community, people we trust, people we call if we are in trouble. George Floyd showed the officers that respect. As I indicated, he never cursed. He never raised his voice. He called Derek Chauvin Mr. Officer, over and over. He didn't know him personally, but he recognized the uniform and recognized what it's supposed to mean. But Officer Chauvin failed. He didn't listen to him. He stayed on him. He faced this crowd. They weren't going to tell him what to do. And he sat there for that entire time as this man laid lifeless beneath him. I start talking about the seriousness of this offense because I think it's important. I think that as time passes, we forget that immediate reaction, right? And we start analyzing and thinking about things, and I think that's certainly important too. But at the heart of this case, it's a murder case. There was a victim. There was a person who was there just like you and me, who was once alive and is no more. And he's missed by his family, and he's missed by his friends and his loved ones. Right? And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we talk about some of these academic and theoretical issues. At the core of this was a man who spent his last moments on this earth surrounded by strangers, not his family, not his friends, not alone. People cared about him. The bystanders did. They tried to help. Right? But he died alone, crying out for his mother, a human being. And his humanity was not recognized. I'm always struck when we talk about our efforts to humanize George Floyd. How sad that in court we have to humanize humans. Right? That's what we do. We have to humanize humans. But it's important because in a trial, so often the victim, their name isn't even a part of the case. Right? The defendant's name is a part of the case. And the victim becomes an object. It becomes an object under somebody's knee, an object of an autopsy slide referred to as the decedent or the victim, not even called by name. And so it's important that we remember that because it's that otherizing and dehumanizing that leads us to forget our core values and our mission in the first place. I took issue with something, there's this thing called excited delirium. One of the signs of excited delirium is supposed to be superhuman strength. And I took issue with that phrase, superhuman strength. There's a lot of debate. Excited delirium is controversial. Right? People are said to have died from it. Someone pointed out that no one has ever lived from it. It seems to happen to people in custody. Right? And so I don't know. I'm not a physician. But I do know this. As I told the jury, there is no such thing as superhuman strength. There's only strength, and they're only humans. Superhuman strength is a fiction. It's a trope. It's something that's dragged out to excuse conduct. And if George Floyd had superhuman strength, I certainly would think he would have used it as he was pinned down by these folks on him. There are no superhumans. There are only humans. And it's not a compliment to call someone a superhuman. You're calling them something other than human. It's otherizing. It's detaching. And it's wrong. So, talking a little bit about leadership and some of the lessons learned in this and what was done then afterwards, or just remember the circumstances on the ground. We were all there, right? The city was in pain. We also had COVID, and there was significant civil unrest everywhere. And of course, the issues had become politicized. People were starting to take sides depending on who's doing the talking without looking at the content. Huge mistake, right? And the governor took the case away, decided that he wanted to have Keith Ellison, the Attorney General of our state, lead the prosecution team. And there were a couple of examples of some real leadership in that decision, in the decision of Chief Arredondo, the day after the murder, to fire those 4 officers, to call it exactly what it was, that took courage, to do that. I respect that. Mr. Ellison, the Attorney General, a man I never met, called me on the phone just out of the blue. He recognized that his team was going to need help, that this was a big case, and he asked me if I would just have a conversation with him. Again, I'd never met the man before, never had any contact with him. I knew of him as a criminal defense attorney before he was the first Muslim elected to Congress, and then he became our state attorney general. I was quite surprised, honored to get a telephone call from this person, and he asked me, would you just talk to me about the case? I just want to hear your thoughts. And I shared it with him. Much like I said in the closing, policing is something that is very important to me. Policing is something that I supported for over 20 years, 2 decades as a prosecutor. Many of my close friends are police officers. I've seen them do their job to run toward danger over and over. And what I saw on TV was a despicable display of abuse of power. And it was a homicide. And there was more than one person involved. Those are my thoughts with the Attorney General. And after that conversation, he said, I'm just wondering if you'd mind helping out a little bit. He's very, very good. Would you mind helping out a little bit? Just, could you maybe join our team and help out with this case? And I was absolutely honored to be asked. Not only that, but watching what I saw on TV and my community in crisis, I was as helpless as those bystanders, powerless to do anything. But the Attorney General asked me for help. He gave me a job. He gave me something to do. And that took leadership on his part to understand that he was going to need help and to call people and ask and to assemble the team that he did. So I went back to my firm and I asked them if that would be okay, and they said absolutely. They didn't even question it. They cleared conflicts, and I was able to join them. And so the prosecution team itself, I want to talk a little bit because leadership is not just about inspiring. Inspiring is very important. We'll talk about some of the dangers of inspiring in a bit, because you can inspire people to do good and you can inspire them to do evil, right? So Keith was inspiring but also very practical, and we set up teams to take a big job and to break it down into smaller jobs and give people who had expertise and understanding tasks within this. And it was an exercise in leadership, an exercise in followership, which then goes back into the leadership. And I want to tell you this as future leaders. When you graduate, we're going to give you the keys to this car, right? You're all going to be in charge. And so I want to make sure that you're making good decisions and do a good job in your careers here. So he set up different areas that we thought that we would need. We broke apart what makes a trial tick. We have narrative and themes, understanding what touches and motivates people, what arguments are going to resonate with juries, and particularly in our venue. Developing the themes, thinking about our order of witnesses, thinking about our jury selection and our opening and closing. We started doing that right away. Jerry and I were on this narrative and themes meeting, and we had a meeting every week. Fact and scene witnesses, understanding that someone was going to have to concentrate on the scene witnesses and doing victim and witness outreach, the logistics. You can have the most beautiful opening in the world, and then if you forgot to subpoena your witnesses, you don't call anyone, you haven't made those arrangements, you're in big trouble, right? There are a lot of people who need to work very hard in front of the scenes, as I was able to do, and behind the scenes to make this happen. Policing, that was my responsibility. As someone with over 2 decades of prosecution experience and someone who had prosecuted a civil rights case before, I led the policing and use of force group so that we could have a case that we could explain why this was excessive force, and then link the use of the excessive force to the death, the medical legal causation. Needed to focus on training, issues involving excited delirium, positional asphyxia, what a reasonable officer would do under like circumstances. Medical causation committee headed by Jerry Blackwell and Lola Velasquez-Aguilu. Jerry has had jury trials in the civil realm. He'd never tried a criminal case before, but really has had trials on just about every organ failure, system failure that you can possibly imagine. And so he knew the medical stuff cold. He designed that case. We knew that we were going to have to deal with issues such as toxicology, cardiology, pulmonology, all the ologies. Jerry was in charge of the ologies, and I just let him fill me in on those a couple of weeks before trial. We knew that we were going to have issues with the defense trying to point to George Floyd's drug intoxication as a possible cause of death, as an alternative, with fentanyl. And the medical team was able to consult with the experts and the people who would be able to put that drug use into proper context and to show that George Floyd did not choose that particular moment after being handcuffed, restrained, and prone on the ground for 9 minutes and 29 seconds to die of a drug overdose or a heart attack. It didn't happen. We had our administrative team who coordinated with the court staff and the defense counsel, handled all of the discovery. We had a media team. We're not able to put media out. That's improper. But we needed to have a team on the ground who could monitor the media and understand what was being said about the case in our jurisdiction so that we could then understand what jury selection was going to be like and what arguments were going to be raised. I was on that team along with Neil Catchall, who is a former Solicitor General, a brilliant lawyer, and the head of our legal research team. They did all of our motions. It's like just drafting Michael Jordan to be on your pickup basketball team. Just really amazing, right? So we had this amazing team of people who, in our own committees, in our own sections, we led. Right? We had weekly meetings. We listened to each other's ideas. We competed with each other. I tell the story of Jerry. The first time we got together, I didn't know him. Right? I met him in the context of this trial, and he put together a presentation that was going to be touching on narrative and themes. And he did after probably having the case about 3 days. He gave this presentation. And it looked like it was the only thing he had worked on for 6 months in that presentation. And I looked at it and I said, oh no. Oh no, you didn't, right? Because next week's my turn on use of force. I got to top Jerry, right? I got to top Jerry. It was a great competition. We spurred each other on. We egged each other on. We challenged each other. One thing that I want to say about assembling this team of, and Keith would always call it a team of Michael Jordans, you got to make sure they pass the ball too, right? You got to make sure they do that. And we did do that. But when you assemble a team like this that's as diverse as we were in terms of experience, I mean, a 52-year-old white guy who was a prosecutor for over 20 years. I have a certain perspective. Jerry, civil attorney, never prosecuted a case, but had done many toxic torts and big multi-district litigation matters. Right? We had a balance of race, balance of gender, and experience. All these different things coming together. It was the most talented and diverse team I've ever worked with. And I want to talk about the power of that diversity, because if you are on a team or you assemble a team as a leader that's filled with people who will only agree with you, who look like you, who came from the same background as you, right, you're going to lose because you're going to miss things. It's really funny what we decide as a qualification. I watched with great interest the Supreme Court judge vetting, right, in the hearings. And we talk about somebody being qualified. And I love that, talking about people being qualified. It's kind of funny. Who decides what a qualification is? What does it mean to be qualified? Oftentimes, we think somebody's qualified because they have a background exactly like ours. Right? That's what makes them qualified. But we look at things. You're used to being ranked. You have your numbers. You have your class rank, you have your GPA, you have your ACT, your SAT, your LSAT, your IQ. You have all these little metrics that they give you that are meant to tell you who you are and how you're defined and whether or not you're qualified. I'm going to tell you what, that's all nonsense, because they can't devise a number. They can't devise a metric. There is no test that really can measure whether or not you're special and how you're special. Okay? Your high IQ doesn't tell me that you're kind. Your LSAT score doesn't tell me if you're going to show up for work. It doesn't tell me if you're moral or you're ethical. And so how am I supposed to know if you're qualified? Right? How am I supposed to know that? Recognize that when you assemble your future team. Don't necessarily gravitate toward the people who look like you and come from where you come from, because you'll miss things that are important. And in this case, literally, because we're going to be trying this case to the 12-headed monster we call the American jury, right? Filled with people with different backgrounds, different races, different genders, different perspectives. And what if we just put ourselves in our isolation bubble and don't think of the argument that's going to touch a particular juror? What if we do that? Then we're going to fail. The importance of this group also is that we were very committed to the cause, to what we were fighting for. This wasn't a fight about money. There's some things more valuable than valuables. This was a fight about justice. And we were all committed to that cause. And so the egos really went away, but we did challenge each other. And as we met in these groups and took notes and had agendas and made conclusions and made arguments, we would meet once a week with the main prosecution team, where the leader from each group would then report to the Attorney General and talk about the case. And then we would talk about it with each other, and we would argue with each other and make each other better. It was an amazing team to be a part of, because we pushed each other and we listened to each other and we respected each other. And when you're assembling your teams, I encourage you to do that, because you'll be successful. Going back then to my main message about forgetting your values and forgetting your core principles, remembering that when we talk about policy and we talk about training and we talk about all of these things that we hope will fix people, and I recommend we try them all, right? I want to point out that a lot of this is baked in already. I mean, this is the prime directive of the Minneapolis Police Department: to protect with courage, to serve with compassion. You're looking at the first line of their use of force policy. The sanctity of life and the protection of the public shall be the cornerstones of MPD's use of force policy. So what's important? What's important? A man lost his life over a fake $20 bill. The struggle became about putting him in the car and getting him into custody, losing sight of the crime, the minor crime you're investigating, and your values and your prime directive, and your people. To protect who? To serve who? To protect the public. The public. And George Floyd was a part of the public. And this officer lost his way, and he turned his back on his duty, and he forgot his values, as did the others. When you go through, and all of us are going to be in situations where we face our adversaries. Facing our adversaries takes courage. It takes strength. But you know what? It's expected. It's expected of you. And so in some ways, because it's expected, it's an easy thing to do, to face your adversaries, because that's your role, and you're supposed to. But I think if we're being honest with ourselves and challenging ourselves, we'll realize that while expecting your adversaries takes courage, facing your friends takes deeper courage. It takes a moral conviction. And no party, no side, no faction has a lock on this, right? This is all of us within us. And we just have to remember, as leaders, in our families, in our communities, in our peer groups, and eventually in your businesses and in the corners of government, it takes courage to face your friends, your contemporaries. And sometimes you have to do that. You have to do that. I want to give it an opportunity for questions and answers before I do that, I wanted to make sure that the one thing that I came here to say was communicated and communicated clearly. We talk about leading to inspire. People will lead by inspiration. You come to a leadership school hoping to leave being an effective leader. I want you to be more than that. I want you to be better than that. Because there's some effective leaders that are just awful people. Right? You can be an effective leader, and you can march 10,000 troops to slaughter people and convince them that's the right thing to do by lying to them. You can be an effective leader and inspire people by appealing to the absolute worst in them, their worst instincts, their worst human instincts. It'd be so easy if people were either good or bad. And we know it's just not true. We're all good and bad. There's good in us, there's bad in us, all of us. You need to reach out as leaders and inspire those people based on the good in them and to find that. I don't want you to be an effective leader if you're going to use and appeal to the worst instincts in all of us. Right? I want you to be courageous leaders. I want you to be compassionate leaders and moral leaders. I want you to be people who are worth following. And that's what I came here to say. So I want to thank you for your time and attention here today and give you the opportunity to ask me questions. There's some questions I can't answer, unfortunately, because I have a trial coming up in June, and so I'll have to pivot away from certain things. But anything about the trial or anything else that someone cares to ask me, feel free. Otherwise, I'll just sit here and start monologuing until someone eventually kicks me off the stage. But anyway. And there's some students who have the microphone, so. Yes, sir.
Just to kick it off, I probably can't hear me. You mentioned the trial coming up in June.
Yes.
What is your continuing involvement?
So I committed to this case, and the trial was severed, and so what was supposed to be one trial. One trial a while ago has now turned into at least two, and so I'm continuing on the trial team in the state trial that's scheduled for June. Yes. Could you please state your name?
Yes, of course. Hi, I'm Sydney. I'm not sure if this is turned on. Oh, hey. I'm Sydney. I'm in Professor Williams' capstone. I was just wondering what the toughest thing about the trial has been for you. I know you've talked about a lot of the highlights working with such amazing people, but I know it's emotionally taxing as well. So,
you know, it is emotionally taxing, and that's a great question. I think it's important that people acknowledge when things are emotionally taxing. You know, as a prosecutor for as long as I was, I've seen many examples of inhumanity to humans. It can be disturbing in different cases, particularly when you've done homicides, child abuse cases. I've done a lot of those. Really, the emotional part was the most difficult. You know, when I get involved in a case is a case, and I get very focused, and I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't something I truly love doing. And I truly love being in trial and working on cases. But seeing a person die over and over and over and over again on video, I mean, I had to have watched George Floyd die 200, 300, 400 times in order to watch every single angle, to get the exact correct still footage, to get the perfect clips, to do all of those things. And that's taxing. It's emotionally difficult, and then particularly then when you're interfacing with his family, right? George Floyd's family. They were fantastic people, very uplifting. And that's not common for folks who have lost someone to homicide. Usually they just don't have gas in the tank to help you and talk to you. But they were just warm, wonderful people. So in a way that made it harder. You know, I was struck by the dean's comments because he was expecting that we might lose. Sure, not a dig on us, right? But just sort of thinking about the pattern and the history of what we were facing. And coming where I'm coming from, even having lost a civil rights case before, I never once thought we were going to lose, right? I did in the year before, as we were working this case up, I think of the flaws, I think of the counter arguments, I make the counter arguments, I do all these things, but going in, I'm very focused. And I'm convinced we're going to win. I don't visualize failure, I visualize success. And as we had gone through the trial and thinking about it logically, I felt that we had won jury selection. I thought, we were successful. We had a diverse jury that I was proud of, that I believed was going to give our case a fair shake. That was the first phase. The second thing we had to win was the bystander phase. We had to make sure that these bystanders were not, otherized and demonized and marginalized, and that the jury would just get a chance to meet these folks and hear what they had to say. And that was successful. And then the use of force phase. I felt that we won the use of force phase. It was very clear that the police have known for 30 years the dangers of positional asphyxia. And to say otherwise was just utter nonsense. Right? And then the medical causation. And if you watched Jerry's direct examination of Dr. Tobin, it was just amazing. Probably the best expert witness I've ever seen. And so I'm thinking of this logically, going, we won, we won, we won, we won. The jury hadn't been out that long, right? And so they hadn't asked any questions. They didn't ask to see any more evidence. So I was feeling like we're going to be successful. As I'm driving there, I think it's got to be guilty. And I'm thinking it's going to be guilty of everything. Jerry was in the dean's camp. It's like, I don't know. I'm holding my breath right to the last minute, waiting to get my heart broken again. I talked to students, law students, undergrad students. I talked to some high school students. And I asked them, when I was watching TV and I saw what happened to George Floyd by the police on TV, I was shocked. Can you raise your hand if you were shocked? And I'll see hands go up. They look a lot like mine. And then I ask them, how many of you weren't shocked? And I see hands come up. And they don't look like mine. Right? Different experience, a different set of expectations. And that's been hard. That's been hard. And so knowing the Floyd family was completely prepared to have their hearts broken again, when I walked in there to collect our guilty verdict and I saw Philonis sitting in the gallery, I all of a sudden just was in a blind state of panic because I was thinking, what am I going to say to this man if they get it wrong? I don't know that I can have that conversation. Right? So it really is the emotional part of it is the most difficult part. But it's important you acknowledge it and give yourself a chance to process it. Thank you for asking that question. Yes?
Hi, my name is Annika, and my question was, although you had like a very optimistic perspective going into the final day of the trial, what were some of your biggest concerns that it would not go your way, and how did you overcome them?
So usually the big concerns are the ones that you can't control. People not showing up, and not wanting to testify. It's terrifying. It's easy for me to ask the questions. Answering the questions, I would imagine, as a witness is very, very difficult. So I was certainly concerned about that. I think that, honestly, my biggest fear is that they were going to try to make George Floyd into some sort of a villain, and superhuman villain who, of course, is at any moment ready to break these handcuffs and rampage the city, right? And talking about prior drug use or prior brushes with the law. Those were my concerns. Not that I didn't think that the jury would be able to get it, even with that context, but because I think it's unfair and I think it's disrespectful. I was also afraid, being on TV, that was weird. Wasn't expecting that. If Keith would have asked everything that was going to happen, like, oh, and by the way, it's going to be on TV and everybody's going to be watching and you're going to have this big role, I might have paused a little bit, but, thinking of that, I just didn't want to do something myself that would get in the way of this case, of this important case. I wanted to do a good job. And I wanted the country, as long as it was going to be on television, which we initially opposed, I wanted them to see the system and have it be transparent. And it's a system that I've worked in a long time, and it's a system that I'm very proud of and care about deeply. And I wanted us to, both for myself and for the defense, I wanted us to show the world our very best. That was something that weighed on me heavily. The other thing, we just didn't know how this was going to come out. the jury selection and composition was very important to me. I believed that if we had a jury that reflected the community in which the crime occurred, in terms of its gender and diversity and makeup, that whatever the result was, there were going to be people who were going to be upset if we got an acquittal. But at least they would believe that they were listened to, that they were given a fair shake, right? And so that's why it was so important for me, and I was so concerned about the jury process, that we would have a jury of people making the decision that looked like the community so that the result can be accepted. And thankfully, we found a jury that was prepared to hear our message. That if you pick a jury and because of some state of mind, they just aren't going to listen to you, then you're wasting your breath. So we took a lot of time with that. That was probably the biggest concern. So thank you for that question. Yes, in the back.
Hello, my name is Sarah. Thanks for being here. My question is, what would you say at this stage of your career prepared you for this case?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't, the state of?
In terms of this case, George Floyd's case, what would you say prepared you for this moment?
Well, I think just the act of going through a lot of cases over the years and really being prepared to take on anything and to say yes to a lot of things. You know, when I graduated from law school, this was in 1995, the economy wasn't that great. I didn't have a lot of prospects, and frankly, I don't think that there was much special about me. I was looking for work anywhere that I could find it. I finally found it. And I took a job as a prosecutor doing traffic court, burning permit violations, dog at large, DWI, right, like everything. And I just took on every single case that I could. And I tried those cases. I learned how to cross-examine people in traffic court. That's where I learned how to cross-examine that expert witness from people fighting their speeding tickets and then taking the stand. I was like, okay, I'll go ahead and do this cross-examination. And pouring yourself into those small cases with the same sense of commitment as you do if you imagine it was a big case. Work as hard as the job that you want. Work as hard as the paycheck that you want, right? If you haven't put the effort in for the things that are small, you're never going to be ready when they call you for something that's big, right? And so really it was the combination of small case after small case, and I call them small, but they're not small to the person who got the ticket, right? It's the most important case in the world. It's the absolutely most important case in the world. And I think that's what prepared me. Just going in, trying my hardest every single case, and getting my teeth kicked in a few times didn't hurt either. I think you learn a lot more from your failures than your successes. And I'll take the civil rights case I talked about that I prosecuted in federal court that I lost. That case was on video. Half the counts were on video. Those were the half that the jury acquitted. The other half were hung. It was crazy, right? Really tough prosecuting a police officer. I learned what I was going to be up against with the police union. That my witnesses weren't going to be there to necessarily help me. That the jury was going to have a hard time accepting that a police officer commit a crime because we're really socialized to trust the police. We do a lot of work on this, right? We have McGruff, the crime dog. We teach school children in the DARE program. We're giving them bumper stickers. We're giving them, baseball cards that have canines on them. We do a lot of outreach, right, that builds trust in the police and knowing just how deeply that goes. Even people, I would suggest there are people in here who I say, do you trust the police, yes or no? Would raise their hand, no. We have a lot of people who say that. And that's probably true in the front of your mind, but if someone's attacking you, if someone's breaking into your house, you're probably going to call the police. In the case I lost, this man was assaulted by a police officer, literally called 911 on his cell phone, right, after being attacked by the police. What other group can you imagine would attack you and you would call another member of that group expecting them to help you? That's very deep in our culture. And so getting my teeth kicked in on that case really spurred me on. It was sort of the ghost that I chased the entire Floyd case. and would explain to my colleagues, you know what we're in for. This is going to be a bumpy ride. But I've been down this path before, and I can provide a little bit of guidance. Yes, in the back.
My name is Erica Vixilio, and I work at the Fountain Fund. We're an organization that provides low-interest loans and financial coaching to formerly incarcerated people. And I was really struck by your talking about what qualifies someone. And really, what qualifies me to lead that organization is something that I've really wondered. And so I've been there for just about 3 years now, and this year decided to move to a distributed leadership model where one of our client partners who's formerly incarcerated is also a director, and someone else that has lending experience is also a director. And so that anything related to client partners and community engagement, the person with the most expertise is making that decision. Anything related to lending and financial education, someone more qualified is making that decision. I've looked for models of this in other places, and I haven't found many examples. And so we're in a school that teaches about leadership, and I wonder if you have thoughts on how we move to more distributed leadership, where people that have the most expertise are able to be in positions of power and authority. Because I think most often it's people that look like me that end up there. I have a UVA degree as well, but really I'm having to sort of flip leadership on its head and bring the board along, right, who I think thought I was nuts to do this, but we're getting there. And it does feel like the right thing to do, but it also feels very unusual.
It is, and you know, there's certainly positive and negative that goes with any leadership model. But what I would encourage in this circumstance, what you're looking to do here, it sounds like, is groom your future leaders, right? That's what you're looking to do. Because if you want to have a shared leadership model, you're building certain redundancies into the system that are going to be effective if, for example, you know, God forbid, something happened to you, right? You can go to work, the organization is going to live on. And so my recommendation is to give real responsibility to people in their technical area of expertise, but not over responsibility. Don't give them responsibility in areas that they may fail at first. Because if you give them the chance to succeed, real responsibility, and give them the reins and the opportunity to do a good job, they probably will. They probably will rise to that. And if they don't, then you're going to find somebody else. But the health of an organization, the true health of an organization, does not really reside necessarily within the leader, because a leader is expendable. A healthy organization is constantly training its replacements, right? Making sure that the organization is going to have perpetual life. That's important. In the Floyd case, as we were talking about our case assignments, we all had our area of expertise, but we all cross-trained in each other's because of COVID. We thought, there's a really good chance that one of us is going to have a positive COVID test on the way to court, and somebody else is just going to have to pick up the case, right? So imagine if we had not created a system where we had independent, thoughtful people leading different parts of the case. The judge isn't going to continue it because I get sick. They're just going to hand the mic to somebody else. Who are you going to hand the mic to? I mean, that's the challenge that you have to have within your own leadership. Who am I going to hand the mic to? Who am I going to hand the job to if something happens to me? If your organization is important, it's worth putting that thought into. Yes. Oh, sorry. Yep.
My name's Ben. I'm an undergraduate student here. And my question for you is, what were your thoughts on this being a murder case rather than manslaughter, which would have made a conviction probably much easier for you and your team?
Mm-hmm. So with this particular case, we're talking about shots on goal because we were wanting to get a conviction, any conviction. We didn't know how this was going to turn out, and we knew that a lot of cases have been tried and failed. And so we charged murder, we charged manslaughter, we charged third-degree murder. We wanted to give the jury a multitude of options so that we didn't come up with nothing. And that was important to us. In other murder cases, you'll fight a manslaughter instruction because you want to get the murder conviction, you don't want to compromise. We would have taken any conviction that they would have given us because the important thing is that he was held accountable. He was held accountable for his action, and we can let the judge sort it out at sentencing. So those were our thoughts. That said, this was a murder case, and our liability theory was very, very clear. It was a felony murder, right? And so the underlying felony was a third-degree assault. That assault resulted in death, and then that activates the felony murder statute. Then the last element we look at is whether it was justified force. So that's how we viewed it.
Thank you.
So listen, I really want to thank all of you for your time. Again, time is the most precious and important commodity we have. I appreciate your time and attention today. It's been an honor to be in this place and in your presence, and I'm just confident that you're going to go and be fantastic leaders in your communities. So thank you so much.
You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you, Steve Schleicher, for an inspiring talk. Let's bring courage, let's bring compassion. Let's not just be effective, let's be ethical as well. Good to see you guys.